Report this week from Better Renting found, once again, that renters are cutting back on essentials just so they can pay the rent. 70% said that they would skip meals or cut back on groceries, and 50% are cutting back on medication. And 60% don't raise issues with their landlord because they're scared of a rent increase in retaliation. And that's why, for so many renters, even if legislated standards are improved, even if they're given better protections, nothing will change, nothing, unless this government fixes the unlimited power that landlords have to hike up the rent and force renters out. Just a few weeks ago, I visited James. He's a Fitzroy renter whose home floods every single time it rains. Bricks in the hallway crumbled when I touched them. Holes in the walls let mice and rats in and out. It clearly did not meet minimum standards, but did the real estate agent care? Not one bit. Because they know that renters have to put their life on hold, they have to fork out exorbitant amounts of money and time just to have their basic rights met. And once you piss off your landlord, well, you can bet that they'll find a way to kick you out. And that's usually by hiking up the rent so much that you give up and move out. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. As long as landlords have unlimited power to hike up the rent and force a renter out, most renters will be too scared to ask for their minimum rights to be met and will continue to live in overpriced, substandard and insecure homes. I'm not exaggerating when I say that most renters are constantly worried about paying their next month's rent. And they live in fear of their next rent increase. The situation is dire. You cannot spin it any other way. In Melbourne, less than 1% of private rentals are affordable for full-time workers in vital roles like hospitality and construction and early childhood education. I know members opposite must be hearing from renters in their electorate saying, "I can't get by." Just one property in Victoria is affordable for someone on the disability support pension, and not one property in Melbourne is affordable for someone on the DSP. There are no properties in the entire state that's affordable for a single person or a single parent with a child receiving youth allowance or job seeker. And here's Labor, patting itself on the back, self-declaring that they're number one for renters. They have manufactured a sustained state of hopelessness, of stress, of financial precarity, which takes a huge toll on renters, with substandard living conditions literally resulting in renters having a lower life expectancy than homeowners. Labor's not winning at anything. How dare you? It's so embarrassing. Labor is failing renters. In fact, this year, rental affordability has hit its worst levels since records began. The Better Renting report is scathing, and it is right when it says Australia's rental system causes real harm. It stops people from living their lives. It puts their health at risk. It makes them homeless. It allows domestic violence to fester. It brings instability into children's lives. People deserve rewarding, meaningful lives that aren't just about working and paying the rent. So when Labor makes a song and dance about some basic reforms and have the audacity to take up 2 hours of parliamentary time to gloat about them, I think I'd speak for the hundreds of thousands of renters in Victoria who are struggling to get by when I say the only way to make renting truly fair is to make unlimited rent increases illegal. What's the use of roof installation if you're too scared to ask for it and can't afford to keep the roof over your head in the first place? While Labor tinkers around the edges, renters are drowning in unlimited rent increases. In the last 2 years, rents in Melbourne have gone up by 23.4%. If Labor had introduced a rent freeze in January 2023 like the Greens proposed, guess how much renters in Melbourne would have saved? $9,938 each in rent increases. Almost 10 grand Isn't that outrageous? Labor could have saved every single renter in Melbourne 10 grand, but instead they're signing $100 million contracts to demolish public housing, and they're handing out tax breaks to developers and investors. Here's the truth. As long as Labor takes policy advice and donations from property investors, they will always be the party for landlords. Shame on you. 1 year after Labor's housing statement, Victoria's housing crisis has worsened on nearly every key indicator. More people are in housing stress in Victoria than any other state or territory, and Victoria has the lowest investment in public and community housing out of all the states and territories. Meanwhile, Labor's landlords collectively made approximately $905,200,000 in 2020 to 2021. So why? Why is Labor so determined to ignore the obvious, to turn away from renters when all they need is the stability and the security that rent controls would bring? What's the big barrier? 16 countries across Europe have some form of rent controls. Renters in the ACT, where the Greens have been in power, enjoy the security of rent controls. The Greens will keep fighting for rent freeze, followed by a cap on rents of 2% every 2 years to allow wages the chance to catch up with astronomical rents. But there are other models that Victoria could choose from around the world other than capping rents to a fixed rate, including tying it to rent ranges or a formula, or linking rent increases to other indexes like the wage price index or the CPI. So what's the big problem, Labor? Why won't Labor bring in rent controls? When I asked the Treasurer last year, he said Labor couldn't introduce rent controls because it would distort the market. What did he mean by that? As though the market is this perfectly formed, perfectly functioning system, and that any attempt to regulate rents would disrupt this perfect balance, disrupt the natural forces of supply and demand. Those forces, those very same forces that allow landlords to exploit renters, particularly when things get tough. But we know there is nothing perfect about the rental market, unless you're one of the 1% making a buck from it. The Treasurer's unwillingness to distort the market shows how this government continues to prioritise profits for landlords and developers over the basic needs for secure and affordable housing. It ignores the reality that in Victoria the housing market has already been distorted by speculative practices, home hoarding, and a focus on luxury developments for investment rather than addressing the pressing need for genuinely affordable homes. And what this argument fundamentally overlooks is the human cost of market-driven housing policies. Labor prioritising the health of the economy in terms of investor and developer profits and capital accumulation at the expense of people's well-being. Because housing is a human right, not a commodity to be traded for profit. By rejecting rent controls, Labor is effectively endorsing a system where people are increasingly vulnerable to rising rents and displacement with no regard for the social consequences. The real distortion is the prioritisation of a few people's wealth over human dignity, as hundreds of thousands face housing insecurity while developers continue to profit. Instead of leaning into the status quo, ignoring renters' real misery, listening to property developers for their policy advice, Labor should be challenging this market-driven narrative and ensure everyone has a safe and affordable house. Rent freeze now.